So good evening, and welcome to the DeVos Medical Ethics Colloquy. My name is Dr. Lola Koch, and I serve as the Director for Strategic Initiatives and the Wasork Center for Healthcare Transformation in the Kirchhoff College of Nursing here at Grand Valley State University. Our college and the College of Liberal Arts and Sciences serve as your GVSU hosts for this biannual DeVos Medical Ethics Colloquy. I'd like to begin by acknowledging my dean, Dean Tricia Thomas, for all of her support, and Dr. Jennifer Drake, who is the dean from the College of Liberal Arts and Sciences, was not able to be here, but she sends her best wishes for the event this evening. Certainly the deans are very vital to the support of myself and Dr. Jeffrey Burns from the College of Liberal Arts and Sciences, who helped to put together this colloquy. The topics covered in these important dialogues on current ethical issues in healthcare directly impact our interprofessional healthcare providers, those who are still students, and those who are actively serving in our community in a variety of healthcare roles. We are pleased to provide this platform to continue this prestigious event and to join in these discussions. Tonight's colloquy will address ethical challenges when dealing with violent situations in healthcare. More information about tonight's event, including information on claiming continuing ed credits, can be found on our event welcome website, gvsu.edu/colloquy. It's also listed on the slide, and for those of you live streaming, it will be listed in the chat. So at the very end of the presentation, it will be on the slide for those of you that need continuing ed credit. It takes about 48 hours for us to process continuing education units if you're a social worker or a nurse. So please allow 48 hours of time to get via email your evaluation form and your certificate. And for CME, if you're a physician, you should have received a handout as you registered that puts you through the whole process of obtaining CME from our participating sponsor, Spectrum Corewell, or Corewell Health, Corewell Spectrum Health. All participants in the live streaming will be put on mute without video during this program. If you have questions for the speakers, each of you in the audience live got two cards. If you'd like to ask lots of questions, there's more cards out at the registration desk. And for those live streaming, please put your questions in the Q&A so that we can address those as well to make it interactive for you as well. So we'll collate those questions throughout the presentations. We have 2 question and answer sessions, one after Dr. Rossoff, followed by a second one after Dr. Feaster, and then an overall Q&A at the very, very end. I'd like to offer a special thanks to our Colloquy Planning Committee for their ongoing support and leadership of this event. We would also like to recognize our principal sponsor, Corewell Health, and our major sponsor, Trinity Health St. Mary's. Now, to give our opening remarks, I would like to introduce Dr. Paul Farr, who is our DeVos Colloquy Advisory Secretary, good friend, and a staunch advocate of this event. Dr. Farr.
Thank you, Lola. Well, welcome everybody. And medical ethics is important to all of us. There are a lot of you in the audience that are too young. Maybe you haven't been patients yet, but patients care a lot about medical ethics. And all health professionals, especially nurses, physical therapists, occupational therapists, pharmacists, and even doctors care a lot about medical ethics. This is the 36th colloquy that we've had, and it started back in 2004. Rich DeVos, who is seated in this picture, told Luis Tomatis, who's standing, that we ought to have a colloquy in Grand Rapids. Mr. DeVos had already had his heart transplant and had had a lot of medical care, and he recognized the importance of having it. So they started it, and in 2015, it was turned over to Grand Valley State University that's held it ever since. So it's remembering these two that started it, and the topics are always fun. I have to thank Lola Koch and the committee for everything they work and do. And now to introduce our moderator is Dr. Jeffrey Burns, who, an assistant professor at Grand Valley, of philosophy in the College of Liberal Arts and Sciences. He does all the heavy lifting, and he tells me what sort of speakers we've got to have. So, Dr. Burns, it's all yours.
Thank you very much, Paul. Welcome, everyone. It's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Brandon Francis. Dr. Francis is the Chief Medical Officer at Trinity Health, Grand Rapids. Dr. Francis has deep experience and credentials in public health, in military and behavioral health. Dr. Francis completed his medical residency at Rush University in Chicago, then served as an active duty member of the U.S. Army Medical Corps as Chief Consult Liaison in Psychiatry and Assistant Chief of Inpatient Psychiatry at Dwight D. Eisenhower Army Medical Center in Georgia. Then he completed a Neurocritical Care Fellowship at Northwestern. It's my great pleasure to introduce my good friend, Dr. Francis.
Thank you, Jeff. Wonderful introduction. Thank you, Lola, Paul. Welcome. We're delighted to have you here. We have a wonderful evening of conversation planned. These incredible speakers are going to share with us some thoughts about how to deal with the epidemic of violence in our healthcare system. We all know that the conversations and interactions we've had with patients has changed over the years. So it is bringing me great pleasure to introduce Dr. Philip Rossoff. Dr. Rossoff is a professor emeritus of pediatrics. He served as the chair of Duke Medical Center Ethics Committee and the Clinical Ethics Service. His scholarly work is in clinical ethics with a concentration on the equitable allocation of health resources. His presentation this evening will address the topic, what should we do about patients and families behaving badly? Please join me in welcoming Dr. Rossoff.
Thank you, Dr. Francis. I appreciate that. And I'd like to thank the organizers of this symposium for asking me to speak this evening. And this is actually the second time I've been in Grand Rapids. I was here in 2009 at this very same symposium speaking about a completely different topic. And the fact that 14 years later that you would ask me back is quite an honor. Thank you very much. Not all interactions between nursing, physicians, trainees, all of us, and patients, families, and visitors are as we might wish them to be, cordial, mutually respectful, and civil. The questions that come up about people behaving badly, meaning behaving in such ways that they are disruptive to our mission of caring, are many, and they include, how should we respond to these situations? Are there measures we can adopt to recognize developing situations early and nip things in the bud before they spiral out of control? How can we manage the tension between maintaining patient and staff safety and understanding and respecting behaviors that are often caused by heavily emotionally laden situations? And finally, what can we do to protect our personal and professional integrity and sense of self-worth when verbally and even physically assaulted because of who and what we are? I hope that my remarks can begin a conversation, although I have little doubt that many of you have been thinking about this topic, if not dealing with it or trying to deal with it, on a daily basis for some time now. If anything, things have been getting worse and more intense over the past few years. While I admit this is a very pessimistic view, I think it unlikely that current conditions in our country that predispose or even encourage bad behavior towards others will lessen anytime soon. So we must do what we can to protect ourselves and our patients and maintain the high professional standards that we rightly hold dear. While I will touch on other aspects of this large subject, I will mostly concentrate on one particular area, that of patients and families making, quite often loudly, insistently, and indignantly, demands about the types of providers who shouldn't and shouldn't be involved in their case. But first, a small digression. On February 7, 2023, Duke Health made a major policy change. Duke Health is a large healthcare organization that used to be known as Duke University Health System, which used to employ me. And it's comprised of 3 inpatient acute care hospitals and numerous outpatient facilities throughout North Carolina. As I mentioned, I used to work for this organization for almost 25 years prior to my retirement in 2019. Per the Raleigh News and Observer newspaper, quote, Duke University, Duke Regional Hospital, and Duke Raleigh Hospital will begin using weapon detection systems in early March, this month. They will detect guns, moderately sized knives, and other weapons in an effort to, quote, give additional safety and security for patients, visitors, and staff members, end quote. Similar detectors have been used in the system's emergency department for many years. Visitors will not have to take off their belts or empty their pockets and bags. The detectors are safe for pregnant women and people with medical devices, though anyone can opt to be screened with a hand wand. Those who refuse screening will not be allowed into the hospitals. Duke Health staff members have faced several violent attacks in the last few years. And as a spokesman said for the university, as acts of violence in healthcare settings begin escalating, we made a pledge to redouble efforts to address safety. As the longtime chair of Duke Hospital's Ethics Committee, I and my colleagues had advocated for increased security at Duke's facilities for many years to no avail. The changes made were marginally incremental and usually reactive after an incident. The refrain was always that we cannot impair the patient and visitor experience by ramping up security. There were numerous open access points to both clinical and research buildings, although curiously not to the vivarium where they kept the experimental animals, in which any and all could and did enter and leave hospitals, clinics, labs, etc. Even when an enraged male partner of a clinic receptionist showed up at her clinic and shot her to death, little changed. Even when a phlebotomist was assaulted on a Sunday morning in the main Duke Hospital, little changed. Only the labor and delivery and nursery areas had locked restricted access. I suppose things must have reached a point where the attitudes towards patient, visitor, and staff security had to evolve. But this kind of worrisome activity had been going on for many years. Why did it take so long to institute this safety measure? Now a small digression. Rising from the ashes of centuries of European religious warfare that resulted in the slaughter of hundreds of thousands, perhaps millions of people, the Enlightenment grew out of the need for people of diverse values and beliefs to live together in a semblance of peace, if not harmony. The liberal polity that evolved has been remarkably successful in reducing religious strife. It did so by carving out a shared space for civil affairs to which all belonged, participated, and contributed. And that was separate from the space reserved for religious commitments and communities. Thus, affairs of state and commerce could take place in this protected area where, at least ideally, it didn't matter what religious faith one professed. This is not to say that people still do not engage in orgies of mass killing, such as the 2 world wars of the 20th century, as well as the ongoing war in Ukraine, simply that these wars have generally not been fought over differences in the gods that people pray to or the rituals of orthodoxy they practice, but for political reasons, however far-fetched they may seem. Nevertheless, we still can see modern-day remnants of the consequences of religious intolerance in the wars engulfing the Middle East and elsewhere, with different adherents of faiths killing each other over who the correct God is and how he or she should be worshipped. Like the disparate versions of Christianity in medieval and Renaissance Europe, where sect battled against sect, current religious wars of prejudice are fought for similar reasons. If anything, the Western adoption of political liberalism has enabled peoples with different interpretations of the good life to mostly tolerate each other's principles and live together in relative peace. But if liberalism means anything, it is the disposition to tolerate views one can't abide and peacefully cope with minority beliefs. It is in this middle space that civil discourse takes place, in which there is a shared commitment to secular values that generally pertain to how civic life is conducted and administered. That there is a constant tension in this arrangement, in which tolerance is tested and the majority's willingness to countenance the philosophy and ideology of others who differ in what they hold important and sacred may be limited. Indeed, it is within the power of the majority to define the boundaries of what they can put up with. Alexis de Tocqueville, in his still trenchant and perceptive study of early American democracy, noted the potential pitfalls of what he called the tyranny of the majority. And he was by no means alone in his concerns. Many of the framers of our Constitution worried about the rights of minorities suffering at the whims, whimsies, and passing fancies of the majority who wielded power, and hence designed the document, and especially the Bill of Rights, to protect these rights as inviolable. But the protection of these rights, the rule that govern how we behave in public, and to a certain extent private spaces are under attack. Some even believe that they are eroding to produce an environment where being someone different or not a member of a majority group can actually be dangerous. Insults and increasingly physical attacks on the basis of what kind of disfavored group you are perceived to belong to are becoming commonplace. And you all know that those doors to the clinics and the hospital don't keep this stuff outside. Civil discourse and behavior between people from different backgrounds can only occur when there is an assumption of mutual respect and equality between the parties. If one person believes the other to be inferior or somehow lower in some way, as for reasons of ethnicity, skin color, religion, etc., there cannot be true civility, only minimal toleration, if even that. This may be sufficient in the short term if it keeps derision, disgust, and dislike under control. But in situations of high emotions and psychological tension, as often occur when people or their loved ones are sick, or when the societal etiquette or rules that we adopt to moderate immoderate behavior become less constrained or loosened, as now appears to be happening in many places, language and behavior that was previously unsayable and unthinkable, except by the most illiberal, becomes liberated. Hence, the entire social basis for people from different backgrounds and different commitments to what they think constitutes a good life to engage with each other in a civic space, be it in politics or in the hospital, breaks down. The question then is, how do we control our environment so that we can fulfill our moral mission to relieve suffering and heal the sick, no matter who they are, if we are insulted or endangered by the very people we are devoted to serving? And while I will focus on verbal behavior, my analysis and prescriptions apply to threatening physical behavior as well, if not even more so. Perhaps unsurprisingly, the increasingly fractious politics in the United States is reflected in the public sphere through newspapers, magazines, and especially online media. Many Americans have remarked that discourse has become coarsened and that previous constraints on what people felt comfortable saying openly have been loosened, the old rules seemingly no longer relevant. Accompanying this flurry of communal, open, and widely broadcasted and available opinion and vitriol is the not surprising rapid growth in hate speech, and more frighteningly, hate crimes. Indeed, at the end of last year, the FBI reported that hate crimes increased for the third consecutive year, with ethnic and religious minorities being the most frequently targeted groups and individuals. One possibility is that the sheer number of jerks has increased, thus accounting for the increase in incidents of incivility. Another possibility is that the filters have come off, so that those people who would have previously kept their mouths shut and their hands to themselves suddenly somehow feel at liberty to say what they feel and do what they feel, no matter what. Or a more frightening likelihood is that the current conditions not only breed incivility with an expanding number of racists, homophobes, anti-Semites, Islamophobes, etc., and combine it with a social climate that gives them free rein to vent their odious views, both verbally and often physically. It may not be remarkable, then, that this breakdown of civility has extended to the healthcare field, and that patients and their families are now frequently seen to have fewer compunctions against making offensive demands for all sorts of things, not least of which is the kind of doctor or nurse who cares for them. After all, everyone, irrespective of her views or others, is susceptible to illness and injury, and as medical professionals, we have entered into a covenant that we will care for all who need our help, even if we don't particularly like the patients before us or find their views reprehensible. Often, racist and discriminatory demands would not be problematic, as individuals are in general free to select their physicians. But in a team practice setting, such as in a hospital, trying to choose caregivers on the basis of prejudicial biases, demanding that one be treated only by a caregiver of the same ethnicity or sexual orientation, for example, can be problematic. Let me illustrate this challenge with a real case. Tonya Battle started working as a nurse in the neonatal intensive care unit at Hurley Medical Center in Flint, Michigan in 1988. In 2012, as she began caring for a newly admitted baby, the child's father asked to speak with her supervisor. He told the charge nurse that he did not want Battle caring for his child because she was African American. Indeed, he did not want any black caregivers. While he made his request, the father, who was white, reportedly showed the charge nurse a swastika tattoo on his arm, presumably to buttress his bona fides as a racist. The charge nurse then brought this to the attention of the nurse manager, who reassigned the patient to a white nurse. The case was escalated to higher management, which agreed to the father's demand. The staff was informed. A prominent statement was put on the patient shift assignment sheet. Quote, "No African-American nurse to take care of baby," end quote. Battle sued the hospital in state court and filed a complaint with the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, alleging employment discrimination in violation of Title VII of the Civil Rights Act of 1964. The case went to the federal district court, but was withdrawn when Battle and the Hurley Medical Center reached an out-of-court settlement. Most of us working in healthcare are concerned, perhaps even appalled, when patients make demands for doctors and nurses or other caregivers that accord with their bigoted sentiments. Even though there may be some reasons to believe that matching certain characteristics of doctors with those of their patients, whether the latter ask for them or not, may produce both more patient satisfaction and even some health benefits, how does one tease apart or distinguish requests that are potentially beneficial from those we find abhorrent? What facts might make it acceptable for an African-American patient to request an African-American doctor, or a Chinese Mandarin-speaking patient to request a physician who is fluent in Mandarin and is also of Chinese ethnicity? At the same time, why do we recoil or find it objectionable that the father of the baby under Tanya Battle's care in Michigan might want a nurse caring for his child with whom he identifies ethnically or racially or religiously, or based on any other superficial traits that we use to characterize people? Clinicians and hospital staff members might view these demands through a modern lens skewed by adherence to the perceived requirements of patient satisfaction grades, especially in the era when hospital reimbursement may be affected by adverse scores. In a competitive hospital market environment, some hospital administrators, physicians, and nurses might believe that accommodation of the desires and wants of the patient, so-called customer service, must rule the day at the peril of negative comments. Indeed, my experience at Duke, when crafting a policy to deal with such demands, revealed the degree to which administrators are hypersensitive to what they perceive to be the imperatives of patient satisfaction. We can talk about this more later on, as I think it is a major complicating factor. One major facet of patient satisfaction is the assumed elements of, quote, patient-centered care, end quote, some of which may be the embodiment of patient rights. It may be worth remarking both parenthetically and perhaps somewhat cynically, and perhaps because I'm old, that I was under the impression that we were in the business of doing patient-centered care well before we invented a name for respecting the legitimate needs and concerns of our patients. As Anstey and Wright point out, the rights or expectations of patients and their families to respectful care in which their needs have primacy must be tempered by some corollary needs of their caregivers to be treated with some modicum of courtesy and respect. They argue that there must be, quote, unambiguous messaging to both parties, end quote, meaning patients and providers, about expectations and limits on behavior. And as nurse and lawyer Edie Browse points out, quote, it's important to make a distinction, however, between a patient requesting the provision of a cultural accommodation and a person requesting the exclusion of certain providers on the basis of ethnicity, race, or other characteristics. Patient-centered care cannot be the rationale for granting such requests, end quote. So for them, the staff and institutional response would seem reasonably straightforward. One cannot justify, either legally or morally, complying with racist requests. Indeed, a number of institutions have adopted policies with zero tolerance for such demands, but it is more complicated than initial appearances may suggest. Because, of course, not all racist demands are the product of rational thought. While no less superficially abhorrent, racist requests to exclude certain providers may be the products of a mental illness of one form or another, and hence excusable in the moment. This is not to say that patients who make such requests when mentally ill may not be bigoted if and when they return to some plausible level of rationality. It is simply that while they are in a mental state in which we would ordinarily not hold them responsible or accountable for either their statements or actions, we should not necessarily respond to them in the same way we would to an individual in full command of his or her faculties. Although accommodating a demand that is based on a patient's delusion, for example, might not be required, doing so might be practical for reasons of personnel safety. For example, I recall a case at our local Veterans Administration hospital of a hospitalized Vietnam veteran who suffered from severe post-traumatic stress disorder of a psychotic variety, and who became violent at the sight of individuals who he interpreted as being Vietnamese, presumably with facial features that he viewed as Asian. The care team decided to ensure that no doctors, nurses, or aides caring for him could provoke him in this manner, primarily for their own safety. It's also important to recognize that seemingly bigoted demands may not be static and fixed, and that the patients making them could be amenable to moderation with experience or education. For example, data shows that initial impressions of what one wants in a doctor, especially the superficial characteristics that are the basis for many discriminatory requests, can be overcome in some instances by demonstrations that even the, quote, wrong kind, end quote, of physician is kind, understanding, and empathetic. A distinction might also be drawn, a fine one perhaps, but a distinction nonetheless, between preferences and demands for a doctor of a particular gender or skin color or ethnicity. Some people may well feel more comfortable with providers with whom they more closely identify. Indeed, where I work, in the so-called buckle of the Bible Belt, patients often inquire about the religious faith of the doctor or nurse caring for them. While they may not insist on someone with concordant beliefs, it is reasonable to think that they may be more satisfied, even more trusting, of someone from the same general faith tradition, if not the identical denomination or sect. But a stated preference is different from a demand. The former is an expression of an inclination that may be gratified or not, whereas the latter is more of an ultimatum, in which failure to meet its indicia may be met not only with disappointment, but perhaps also with anger and resentment. Complicating what might appear to be a straightforward problem of accommodating or not the demands made by bigots is the well-supported observation that gender and race concordant patient-provider dyads produce better health outcomes. Now, admittedly, for the latter, these data are almost always examined among populations of patients who have historically been the victims of discrimination associated with past and ongoing health inequities. Although race concordant provider-patient pairs may indeed be less susceptible to the implicit bias that is the major cause for many race-based disparities in healthcare, increasing the diversity of the healthcare workforce in general could lead to similar outcomes by altering the behavior and attitudes of others. Nevertheless, are there philosophically and morally compelling differences between a woman asking for a female gynecologist, a black man requesting an African-American internist, a Mandarin-speaking patient demanding a doctor whose primary language is Mandarin, and a white person requesting a white doctor? In cases like these, one might first look for the reasons grounding such preferences. But while that may be satisfactory much of the time, in many situations the answers may be simply confounding. For example, if an African-American patient asks to see a doctor of the same race rather than a white doctor because the patient has greater trust in someone of the same general background, and conversely distrusts the symbol of cultural and professional hegemony, the first part of the rationale behind the request might be disturbingly similar to the reasons given by a white person who wants a white doctor, or for that matter, to the Nazi adherent father who wanted a white nurse to care for his daughter and didn't want Tonya Battle to care for his daughter. Why should we respect one patient's prejudice and not that of the other? One explanation could be based on the historical and ongoing explicit and implicit cultural and systemic racism experienced by black people in America, an experience that could be factored into a justification for accommodating, to the extent feasible, such a request by a black patient but not by a white patient. The former could be said to be based on legitimate concerns, while the latter stems almost exclusively from bigotry. And that may be the key distinction that warrants respecting one and not the other. One could also use the same reasoning to reject demands for straight caregivers and other racially or ethnically biased preferences such as religion. This analysis is less plausible, though, when applied to same gender and same language requests. However, acceding to patient demands in these domains is not unreasonable and is unlikely to offend caregivers as much as being rejected for their ethnicity, sexual orientation, or religion. Nevertheless, there is a potential trap here in this approach that could yield an outcome that many may view as unacceptable. If African American patients demanded black doctors and nurses and were accommodated, it could result in a situation that prima facie resulted in a segregated patient-caregiver population replicating that which existed 50 or 60 or more years ago, even if for more honorable and justifiable reasons. Finally, as far as requests regarding the gender of the caregiver, It may be valid to note a difference between requests for same-gender nurses or doctors and the legitimate reasons grounding the request and those against a provider. We are all familiar with the cases where patients or their families refuse to be seen by a female physician, a lady doctor, or a male nurse solely on the basis of views they hold about the abilities or competency or sexuality of these individuals. These examples illustrate well that this problem is not necessarily as straightforward as one might superficially think. It's complicated. The reasons for the views and actions of people matter, and healthcare professionals should explore them rather than rejecting such requests or demands immediately and automatically. Unless there is an issue of staff safety that needs to be addressed urgently, and in my view, safety always takes precedence over other considerations. There should be time to explore the situation a bit more to gain some understanding prior to reaching a judgment that could have significant consequences for all involved. Now, some have also suggested that the Federal Emergency Medical Treatment and Active Labor Act, or EMTALA, requires that patient demands be met. This is patently false, as there is no language in either the law itself or the final regulations stating that patient demands, such as racist demands for a particular provider or excluding particular providers, must be met in the course of performing a medical screening exam or treatment for clinical stabilization. Whether to accommodate these demands is purely at the discretion of the treating institution, and to believe that the institution must do so is an erroneous interpretation of the law. Patients, other than those who need immediate medical attention, do not have a right to the satisfaction of their demand to be seen by a physician or nurse of a specific type. Of course, they can choose their caregivers as they see fit, and they are free to seek out doctors and nurses they feel most comfortable with, even if it is on the basis of personality or skin color. They are also free to refuse to be seen by caregivers. In the emergency department, where EMTALA's requirements are active, if they do not like the personnel who are there to serve them, they are free to leave against medical advice, as patients do all the time when they don't feel like waiting, and seek care elsewhere. The question is what to do when the patient wants to be seen and needs to be seen, just not by that person. Law professor Kamani Paul Emile has argued that Title VII of the 1964 Civil Rights Act does not and should not cover race and ethnicity-based preferences for physician and presumably nurse providers on the part of patients, but that respect for patient autonomy requires that doctors and nurses yield to their demands. But I think she misunderstands what the power of individual autonomy rightly confers on a person in the realm of healthcare, and perhaps in other domains. It is the right to decide what happens to oneself. There is not a corollary right to have others meet your demands about what should happen to you or for certain behavior towards you. Of course, people have a reasonable expectation that they should be treated similarly to others in their clinical situation, but that is a matter of fairness and justice, not autonomy. Irrespective of whether we buy Paul Emile's reasoning, one could plausibly argue that healthcare providers have an ethical duty to resist racist and bigoted demands of patients as a matter of their own professional autonomy and collegiality. After all, institutions presumably hire their staff members on the basis of their race, ethnicity, and gender-neutral competencies, and not because they are looking to have, say, African-American doctors exclusively available for the African-American patients and Jewish nurses available only for their Jewish patients. This is not to say that there are not reasonable and justifiable exceptions to this rule, as U.S. federal courts have held in employment discrimination cases, in which they have carved out what they term quote, bona fide occupational qualifications. In other words, in certain circumstances, employers can be justified in hiring based on personal characteristics such as religion, sex, and national origin, and this may be justified to achieve aims of having a diverse workforce or to better serve a diverse clientele. Such permissible and justifiable discrimination can make it possible for a healthcare institution to grant the wishes of female patients who request female physicians, when feasible, to perform gynecological examinations, or of religiously adherent Muslim women who request female caregivers without violating the basic tenets of the law, or for that matter, both our moral intuitions and sense of professional integrity. Accommodating racist demands makes a powerful statement about the institution in which the accommodation takes place, not only in the moment and to the demanding patient and the rejected provider, but also in general to other members of the staff and to the community. It says that the hospital or clinic believes that complying with bigoted patient demands, basically transforming the unreasonable and unacceptable into the reasonable and acceptable, satisfying their immoral requests is more important than respecting the dignity of both their staff members and the majority of patients who do not hold such repugnant views, or at least do not act or voice them openly. And simply because an institution could accommodate racist patient demands does not entail that they should do so. Institutions plausibly have a duty to present a moral face to their community by refusing to honor bigoted or prejudicial requests or demands as a matter of course, up to and including declining to care for such patients, except in emergency situations. So how should we take care of bigoted patients who wish their doctors and nurses to accord with their bigoted views? Surely these people are as entitled to the less prejudiced to have their illnesses addressed, unless we wish to hold that the very fact of their bigotry walls them off from the inclusive approach to human suffering that is the hallmark of medicine. But even Nazis are capable of being sick and injured and thus stimulating our compassion for their suffering as fellow humans. Of course, autonomous individuals with decision-making capacity are clearly free to choose to seek care from providers more to their liking, unless their medical conditions preclude them from doing so in the moment, such as with people requiring emergency or urgent care. One plausible method of distinguishing between acceptable and unacceptable demands and accommodations could be an approach created in Canada. The Caregiver Preference Guideline developed by the Toronto University Health Network can serve as a useful mechanism for assessing the difference between discriminatory requests that stem from bigoted beliefs and those that may be more legitimate and justified, analogous to those outlined by the federal courts as bona fide occupational qualifications, as I described earlier. In this method, carefully trained individuals at separate institutions follow a flowchart in which there is a stepwise determination of the underlying reasons. And here I want to emphasize, this is an exploration of reasons for a particular request or demand. For the prima facie discriminatory request for a certain type of caregiver, if they decide that the request can be justified within the constraints of institutional policy, justified, legal requirements and staffing needs and safety, then it can be reasonably met. If not, then a firm stand against it should be taken. Institutions that instead adopt rigid, inflexible procedures that do not allow for judicious considerations of the hard cases, that are not clear-cut exemplars of either permissible and tolerable requests or outright proscribed demands of racist or other forms of morally indefensible beliefs, like the swastika-bearing father's objection to having Ms. Bottle care for his son, can fall prey to disregarding legitimate patient needs. Moreover, acceding to unjustified or unacceptable racist demands can hurt people, sometimes grievously. As a teaching institution, a request to prevent a student or other learner of a certain race or gender from being involved in the care of the patient could result in particularly vulnerable individuals being prevented from accessing a reasonable learning activity and being psychologically harmed because of their inexperience. Accommodating such patients and their families amounts to a statement about the values and priorities of the institution, be it a nursing home or a hospital, as Tanya Battle expressed in her lawsuit. While a central mission of healthcare organizations is to address the clinical needs of all patients, that mission does not require that institutions and the people responsible for directing them, the administrators, the senior medical faculty, head nurses, and the like, pander to the bigoted beliefs of all who seek care. Unless the patients need immediate attention, they can take their bodies and their racist views elsewhere. It remains up to us to control the rules of permissible behavior within our institutions. We must set the nominal requirements of equality between patients, families, and staff so that the minimal expectations of civil discourse can proceed. Those patients or families who refuse or cannot abide by those rules should be given an ultimatum in order to maintain order and self-respect for ourselves. Thank you.
So you talked a little bit about incivility and how people engage with their perspectives. Can you help us think through the difference in how you engage in the space? Because there is a legal definition of incivility, and then there's a social contract we all have with each other. How do you approach that in the hospital for people that are behaving badly? Just because we get so caught up thinking about the legal consequences of people's actions, and really there's this social contract we have with each other being part of a community. And how you think through that in this space.
Well, so clearly there is the civil space that we occupy outside of our working lives. At the grocery store. Although if one gets out and about, one increasingly sees that that civil space has become constrained and is very often not as civil, as I mentioned, as not as civil as it used to be, with people yelling at cashiers or various acts of uncivil, we would now call uncivil behavior or immoderate behavior. I think the type of civility that occurs, or we would like to have occur, within a hospital, for example, is a different type of civility. It is constrained by space. We are in a physically confined space. It is constrained by high degrees of psychological and emotional tension. It is constrained by lots of people from all sorts of different walks of life, most of whom don't want to be there, as opposed to the other areas of civil life, such as the grocery store. Presumably you go to the grocery store because you may not want to go to the grocery store, but you have to go to the grocery store to buy your groceries. But most people don't want to be sick, and certainly most people, I've rarely met anybody who wants to be in the hospital. And I think the rules governing civil behavior in that professional space, both between the professionals, as well as the professionals and the patients, are perforce much stronger, and they have to be. And the ability to tolerate immoderate or uncivil behavior, I think, is much less within that constrained space in hospitals or healthcare institutions, even though we are, as healthcare professionals, we are at pains to understand the emotional turmoil that patients and their families are going through. And we do an enormous, particularly nursing staff, bending over backwards to accommodate their suffering, both psychological as well as physical.
And that sort of brings us to our first question from the audience. We know patients have better outcomes when their caregivers look like them. So isn't that rationale for them to request someone that looks like them?
Okay. So first of all, that data comes almost exclusively from two groups of patients. Black patients, and most of the studies are with black men, and most of the studies are cardiovascular studies, and with women with gender concordant gynecological issues. And that's where the overwhelming majority of data comes from. And as I mentioned in my talk, if you take a look at this data, and the outcomes are usually things, the measures that people look at are usually things like adherence to medication regimens. So do you take your blood pressure medication? So if you take a look, so one of the biggest studies I think, was with African American men with hypertension. And is there better adherence to taking blood pressure medication and better blood pressure control, with if they have black physicians than if they have other physicians, white physicians, for instance? And the answer is yes. Okay. Do women who get female gynecologists, which is a lot easier these days because 90% of gynecologists are now women, do they have the same types of outcomes? Do they come to see their doctors more frequently? Do they don't skip their appointments? That kind of stuff. And the answer is yes. But the important point here is that these are two groups of people, two groups of patients who have historically suffered at the feet of the medical system. Because if you take, let's go back to the African American patients again. If you take a look at two groups of patients who are clinically similar, once again, and this is a bias of the research system, mostly men, with coronary artery disease. Who gets more? And this is proven coronary artery disease with, let's say, unstable angina or semi-stable angina. Who gets more stents and gets their pain relieved, and presumably also delays or eliminates the risk of MIs? Who gets? The white patients. And that's less so in a smaller subset where there are black cardiologists seeing those patients. So here are, and the women in the audience may or may not identify with this, but that has been historically true with women with male gynecologists who've had complaints, particularly one disease in particular has been studied very, very well, which is endometriosis, where male gynecologists would say poo-poo, or for that, or cancer care. So you could make an argument amongst these historically these historic groups of patients who have suffered at the feet of the medical system from this implicit and maybe not so implicit bias, that maybe this is not such a bad idea. But the downside of it is, as I mentioned, if we have all of our African American patients taken care of by African American doctors, then we've replicated the system that we had 70 years ago.
Some in the audience might suggest there are some key differences between that period of time and our current period of time.
Absolutely.
And another question from the audience asks, if people are paying for their own care, should they be allowed to request specific providers?
So let's assume, for the sake of argument, that there's one person left on the face of the earth who's actually, well, there are lots of people who pay out of pocket, but let's assume some rich person comes in and says, well, let's forget about rich people because they're a class amongst themselves. That's a whole separate talk, by the way. The VIP patient. That assumes that simply because you are paying yourself, that you are a different kind of patient than some other kind of patient who's having somebody else pay for it. And that your whims, whimsies, prejudices, biases, etc., are more deserving of respect than the ordinary other person, who may be just as bigoted, but is having Blue Cross or Medicare or Medicaid or something else pay for it. And I don't buy that. Now, I, thank goodness, was never a hospital administrator. No offense. But I worked with a lot of them. And I alluded to this in my talk. In 2011, when this first really started going over the top with these discriminatory demands, the ethics committee where I used to work started talking about this. And we proposed a hospital policy, which basically was 4 sentences. And we worked with legal counsel and all these various people, which basically said, unless there are good reasons to accept one of these demands, and we carved out women requesting female gynecologists, et cetera. Carved out emergency care. The institution would not respect these demands. And we would be happy to arrange transfer or to another institution where the patient would be happy. 1 year later, after multiple rounds of massaging by administrators and patient satisfaction supervisors and things like that, our original 75-word policy was now a page and a half long, with all sorts of carve-outs and exceptions. And by the way, I wrote a paper and published this in a journal called Narrative Medicine, and it was called Making Sausage, about all of the iterations that we went through. And so basically what we were left with was a policy that that barely resembled what we started off with, and paid homage to patient satisfaction, that we don't want to piss people off.
That might be part of the drive, because that's how reimbursement
Yes,
has changed,
yes.
right? And so the question really, the audience is really interested in thinking about trauma patients. Are those considered, for example, sexual abuse trauma patients?
Yes.
Are those considered differently than the average patient requesting X or Y? They want a provider that they don't feel threatened by or endangered by, right? And I guess the real underlying question from the audience is, who gets to decide this? And what's the rubric?
So I mentioned at the end of the talk the system that was put in place in Toronto. Now, there's many things that Canada does that are much more sensible than what we do. Even today, it's a much more civil place than the United States, and much less fractious. And Toronto is a very big city. There's, 3.5, 4 million people? Numerous large hospitals, and they're not all one healthcare system like many of our American cities are governed by one big boss healthcare system. And they all got together and they created this framework where there are people at each individual institution with this algorithm that they work through, where there is somebody on call 24/7. And most hospitals have an administrator on call 24/7, even if they're not in-house, who are trained to ferret out the rationale, the reasons that people have for making these types of demands, even at 3 o'clock in the morning. And if the demand or the request meets the criteria for reasonableness with adequate justification and reasoning, then it's met, if it is feasible. So let's say, and actually I spent a whole evening with our Department of Obstetrics and Gynecology talking about this very same issue, where 90% are women, but there are 10% men. What happens if a woman comes in who is demanding a female gynecologist, but there's only men in the house. What do we do? And that's a difficult one. And there were mixed feelings. And I can assure you that there were not many female gynecologists, faculty or otherwise, who were willing to take extra call to be the backup female gynecologist for somebody, for the male gynecologist who was on call. Take that to extremists. Are we going to have backup black doctors? Are we going to have backup Mandarin-speaking doctors? Are we going to have, I mean, you name it. One of the things, particularly as more and more men have gone into nursing, has been people demanding that male nurses not take care of them on the assumption that any man who goes into nursing must be gay. And so it is a homophobic request and demand. And should this be an accommodation? Now, the Toronto network would say no. But I can assure you it happens all the time.
Thank you so much for your thoughts. Can we thank Dr. Rossoff for joining us?
Thank you very much.
Please join me in welcoming our next speaker. Dr. Autumn Feister is the founder, director of the Penn Program in Clinical Conflict Management at the University of Pennsylvania, and education officer for the Department of Medical Ethics and Health Policy, Perelman School of Medicine, University of Pennsylvania. Dr. Feister is the faculty program director for the Master of Science in Medical Ethics, Department of Medical Ethics and Health Policy at the Perelman School of Medicine at the University of Pennsylvania. Dr. Feister will speak on learning the skills of mediators to de-escalate combative clinical encounters. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Feister.
I'm going to talk about what kind of skills you might build tonight that would enable you to work with patients who might be combative, who might be and families that might be acting in an uncivil way. I do want to say, if at any point you feel physically threatened, you should call security. Mediation is not for when you feel physically threatened. But short of that, I think there's a lot that can be done to help you manage these kind of encounters. And if you're not clinically active, but you someday will be, that's what you're in school for. These are techniques that you can use in the future, but you can also use them at home. You can use them with colleagues in whatever professional settings. So I'm going to try to do three things. I'm going to talk about how you can think about problems in a different way that will enable you to have some traction in constructive resolution of these conflicts. So what I'm going to call employing a kind of technique to get to the source of these conflicts. Then I'm going to talk about a very classic distinction in mediation theory between positions and interests. And finally, I'm going to talk about anger, how hard that is, but how reframing anger could really give you a new lens into thinking about how to navigate these very challenging dynamics. So I'm going to introduce the Mediator's Toolbox. There's lots of tools in it, but I'm going to talk about just a couple of things. So first, how to think about the problem differently, how to get a handle on what's going on interpersonally when you're witnessing a conflict. And these skills can be used when you are the one in the middle of the conflict or when you're the one brought in to try to navigate the conflict. And to do that, I want to introduce a patient named Fred. So let's think about some of these techniques through the case of Fred. Here we go. Fred is a 16-year-old with an incomplete C4 injury to his spinal cord as the result of a gunshot wound. That means he's currently unable to move his arms or legs, though he does have sensation in his lower extremities. Before his injury, Fred attended school intermittently and was on probation for heroin possession. Fred was admitted to an inpatient rehabilitation unit after 2 weeks in acute care. His mother is unable to visit during the week because of her work schedule, and the patient's only other living relative is an elderly grandmother who's homebound. Since he's come to the rehab hospital, Fred has been verbally abusive to staff. His cursing often loud distresses the other patients, as well as the physicians and other staff. Fred often complains of pain and screams loudly when moved, though his physicians insist he's on the highest dose of narcotics that they feel comfortable prescribing. Because of Fred's language and derogatory comments, both physicians and nurses are starting to refuse to work with him. Fred is clearly going to be perceived as difficult on the unit. So let's think about how mediators would start to think about this problem. So the first thing I want to introduce you to is the concept I'm going to call the view from everywhere. This is basically getting into somebody else's shoes, putting yourself into somebody else's shoes. When you're dealing with somebody who's not behaving civilly, somebody who's combative, the first thing a mediator wants you to try to do is get into that person, try to get into that person's shoes. Or if you're the person you're watching the staff really suffer with some kind of intervention, you're going to try to get into that staff member's shoes. This is what we're going to call the view from everywhere. In a conflict, mediators are going to try to capture the perspective of everyone in the conflict, not just one stakeholder, not just one party, all of the people that are involved in the conflict. And that's an exercise in empathy. But the thing is, there's two meanings to empathy. One kind of empathy is emotional empathy. When you're at a movie and you're finding yourself crying because of something that's happening on screen, that's what mediators call affective or emotional empathy. You're sharing the feelings of other people. You're vicariously experiencing what someone else is experiencing. This is not what is needed to get to do this exercise of the view from everywhere. In fact, it can actually be quite detrimental to feel for people all the time. You can actually short circuit and get to compassion fatigue. So I'm not at all advocating emotional empathy in this exercise. I'm actually talking about cognitive empathy. And this is where you imaginatively try to get into somebody else's perspective. When we talk about put yourself in somebody else's shoes, we're not talking about crying with them. We're talking about using your analytic skills, your cognitive ability to imagine what it is that they see and why they see it. Now, the exercise you're going to do is to try to imagine that person's worldview. But if you actually have somebody in front of you, you're going to try to ask them for their worldview. But to build the mediator muscle, we're going to try to think about the view from everywhere by trying to think about first the staff's perspective and then Fred's. So the first thing I want you to do is imagine what the staff's perspective would be. The staff that wrote this case, what do they see? How do they perceive the problem? What's their perspective? And let's be quick because I'm on the clock here. So I can't wait 10 minutes for you to get an idea. This is a brainstorming session. Let's go. What is it?
He's a jerk.
Yes, people are going to say he's a jerk. That's the problem. Fred's the problem. Give me more. How do they see it? Go ahead. Raise your hand just so I can call on people quickly. Go ahead. Oh, it wasn't a hand.
That's okay. No, he's like a troubled kid.
He's a troubled kid. Exactly. And I love your facial expression, which not everybody can see. But when you said troubled kid, I mean loser, like, right? Go ahead.
He doesn't want to get better.
He doesn't want to get better. Every single day we're here and he doesn't even want to get better. Doesn't want to get better. You got that one. All right. What else?
Doesn't want our help.
He doesn't want our help. And what does that feel like to you every day in, day out? What does that feel like to you? Yeah, it does. It does. Because you're getting in there every morning. You're the one who has to face this. What else? Couple more. What does it feel like? You're tired. You're tired every single day. In fact, when you know that you're the one who's got to take care of him, how do you feel going into the day?
Exhausted.
Exactly. You're exhausted and the day hasn't even started. What else? Go ahead.
Like his past history with addiction plays into the narcotic.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, he's really in pain? Come on. Let's think. Okay, great. You did a great job with that and you did it quickly. I'm so pleased. But now here's the challenge. Now I want you to put yourself in Fred's shoes. And I want you to think about what it's like to be Fred. But I also want you to think about your reasons for why you're so angry. I know you're angry at God. I know you're angry at the shooter. I know you're angry at fate. But you're also angry at these doctors and nurses, and I want you to tell me why. Because a lot of times when I do this exercise, we get the staff. Man, we nail the staff like this. But if you want to really put yourself in somebody else's shoes, I want you to imagine a rational person who's mad at these people. He's mad at these people. Yes, he's mad at God and fate. He's also mad at these people. So I want you to tell me, Putting yourself in Fred's shoes, what does Fred see? Go ahead. I'm being unheard. Every single day I try to tell these people and they don't listen.
So decreased autonomy, right? So this is a patient who has no more control.
I don't have any control, and it sucks to have no control. That's true. But why am I mad at these people? Go ahead.
You've probably been mad this whole life. So.
Maybe. I've been mad my whole life, but the thing is, why don't I like this doctor or this nurse? What is going on here? What am I seeing day in and day out?
They're pushing me to do things I can't do.
They do. They push me. They push me all the time. Good.
All the feelings you were saying about the staff, you can sense that they're frustrated and they're
Okay, I sense that they don't like me. I can sense that they don't want me to be here. Great.
I think sometimes when people really hate themselves or they hate their life, they can't accept like compassion from them.
True, but do you think that if I said, Fred, do these people care about you? Does Fred say yes? Probably not. What's going, go ahead.
Nobody's cared at.
What? Nobody cares. That's right. Nobody's caring for me. I agree, but the question is, if we said, Fred, do these people care about you? Do these people want to take care of you? Do you feel heard? I think Fred's going to say no. Go ahead.
Well, I just feel that they don't care.
Yeah.
They don't see me.
I think that right. Nobody sees me. They don't see me. They see some kind of facts about me. They think they know me, but they don't see me. They can't visit because they've got, my grandmother's homebound, my mother's got to work, she's got to work to put food on the table. They're looking at me and they're saying, oh, you have no visitors. I have no visitors because she's got to put food on the table.
I have to do things on their schedule.
That's right. You know, when actually, as an aside, when I got this case, one of the Fred patient complaint was that they wanted him to do physical therapy at 7 in the morning. Do you know a teenager who wants to, I said, is there an old person at this rehab hospital who's up at 4:30 anyway? It has to be Fred at 7? All right, good, you've done great here. Now, keeping all this in mind, let's go to the classic dichotomy of mediators. They use this dichotomy called positions versus interests. You did a great job in that exercise of trying to put yourself, very good job of putting yourself in the staff's position. It's not easy. Putting yourself in Fred's position, man, he does not think things are going well. Great. Second skill, positions versus interests. I didn't make this up. I wish I did. It'd be very famous. This comes from the Harvard Negotiation Project in the 80s, Getting to Yes. And I've stolen this from clip art off the internet. I want you to think about the tree. And the trunk and the branches are what you can see. The roots are what you can't. That's how we're going to think about this term. Positions are above the soil line. Interests are anchoring the tree. Positions are our outward behavior, our outward stance, the thing we say, the positions we take. But interests are what lie underneath. If positions are the what we're saying, interests are the why we're saying it. They are our anchoring reasons. So the position is the stance that you take. For example, I want you to start dialysis. The interests are, why do I want you to start dialysis? Okay? So positions and interests. Now, we know that Fred is saying stuff on the unit. He's cursing and screaming. Okay, but now I want you to tell me what his interests are. What is the skin in the game? And to get to interests, we've got flag words. Why do we do this? We do this because when people have diametrically opposed positions, a classic in medicine, I want you to start dialysis on my husband. We're not going to start dialysis on your husband. I think your husband should have a DNR order. I don't want a DNR order. Positions are often at loggerheads. They admit of no compromise. I'm a Republican. I'm a Democrat. But if you can get to the why, you can start to have a transformation, because interests are human. Positions are partisan. Interests are human. So when you're dealing with somebody combative, somebody who's treating you uncivilly, try to get to the why, because you're going to see them differently and maybe even have a path forward. So here are the flag words for how you get to interests. Fred is worried about. Fred has a need for. Fred is concerned about. Fred values. Those flag words get you to the roots. So now I want you to tell me, what Fred is worried about, needs, concerned, values. Fill in one of those for me. And then I want you to think about how now imagine that you're the staff and you're trying to think about Fred's interest. Watch the transformation that happens in your heart when you start doing these interests. Start giving them to me. You can use any prompt. Fred is. Quick.
Worried about his future.
He's worried about his future. He's a quadriplegic, for heaven's sake. Yes?
He values his independence.
He values independence like everybody else.
Has a need for pain relief.
He has a need for pain relief. He needs somebody to get this pain under control.
Concerned about never having any independence.
He's worried about not being able to be independent.
He's worried about what happens when he leaves the rehab.
He's worried about what happens next. Good. What does he value? Tell me what he values. He does. He values independence.
When he wants it, he won't be able to do that.
He does value independence. What else?
He values his family.
He does. He values his family and he's not able to see them.
On that same point, companionship.
He values companionship. Can you imagine how hard it is for 16-year-old friends to get to a hospital? They're scared. They don't know how to get there. They don't probably have the bus fare, right? Good. What else? What does he have a need for? A need. What does he have a needs for? Give me a couple of these and we'll move on. Good. He has a compassion. He has a need for compassion, a need to be heard. Excellent. Now think about that. From the description that we had when we put ourselves in the position of the staff to when we get to interest, think about the transformation in what we now think. We're at a point now where our heart goes out to the guy. Interests are transformative. So I'm going to introduce you to the 7 maxims of mediation from a paper I'm happy to give you. But these are like little nuggets. Nugget number 1. Difficult people should be viewed as a syndrome and not a species. If you just say this person is difficult, well, that's it. A cat's a cat, a dog's a dog, done. But if you think that the combative behavior you're seeing, the uncivil behavior you're seeing is the symptom of something, a syndrome and not a species, you're going to be much more open to trying to get to that why and get to some kind of solution. And number 6, when you can uncover interests, you can start to name their concerns. You can start to show how they are 360. They're not a paper doll, 2-dimensional. They're 360. They're a full human being, and you can start to show that. You can start to demonstrate an alliance. Certainly, you can block becoming an adversary. You get a starting point. So that's some of the benefits of positions versus interests. All right. To really get a handle on the problem, we talked about diagnosing the problem by putting yourself in somebody else's shoes, and we talked about discovering the interests of patients and families to try to get out from being at loggerheads. Now we're going to look at anger. We're going to look at a new understanding of anger and how to manage somebody who's spewing anger in your face. Again, if you think you're going to get hurt, call security and stop with this talk. But if you feel like, look, it's just it's just words, here's some techniques for you. 1, I want you to, in order to introduce this, I need you to meet Katie. Can you see that text? Get all the way to the bottom. My favorite. You ready? You're a stupid mother. I mean, it's just like, Katie's my daughter. Katie is angry. I like to use this text. It's 8 years old now, but it still makes me laugh every time I get to the bottom. You're a stupid mother. It's just, Katie's obviously very angry. Why do I like to use this text? Because I want to show you that if you can reconceive anger, and if you can learn a couple of techniques, you can use it where you live. Right? Not just in a professional context, but in the people that really get under your skin. Your spouses, your loved ones, your kids. You can use it here too. And Katie's not actually her name. All right. What are you going to do what are the governing principles in somebody spewing like this, whether it's text or verbally? Here we go. Number 1. I'm going to say some things that are very controversial. The good news is, after I leave, you can throw it all. It doesn't matter, right? But I'm going to tell you some things for you to think about. If you were already doing this intuitively, you wouldn't need me to be talking to you, right? I'm trying to give you something new, something novel. All right, here we go. Number 1, leave your ego out of it. I don't mean you've got a big ego. Ego in the Freudian sense of the I. If you want to de-escalate or diffuse somebody's anger that's coming at you, you have to get rid of your feelings of offense and hurt and how dare you and what about me. You've got to get rid of the I, the me, the mine, what about me. You've got to get to a place of neutrality. You have to remove yourself as a partisan and get to a neutral, get to a zen. It's not, this is not what a daughter says to a mother. It's, I'm a problem solver. And I'm not going to make this about me. 7 maxims. Number 5, exercising neutrality way ups the odds of conflict resolution. Take yourself out of the conflict and get to that very zen place where you're a neutral. That's number 1. Number 2, get off the high horse. Do you think that 14-year-old Katie does not know that this is an inappropriate text? And let me just tell you, and you're going to appreciate this, we're in Michigan. When I tried this in South Carolina, people never forgave her. They still haven't. There were words in this that began with the letter, wait for it, F. Do you think, and my husband said she'll never get into Penn. You know, I'm a Penn professor. I use this at Penn. She'll never get into Penn if you keep all those Fs. So I redid the text and I grabbed all the Fs. And it wasn't F. It was the 4 letters total, right? Okay. Do you think that she doesn't know that that's wrong? Of course she knows it's wrong. So what good would it be for me to get on the high horse and say, It would do no good at all. If you want to de-escalate somebody's anger, you've got to stop wagging your finger at them while they're angry. And if I'm right, and I am, after you've solved their problem, you know what they're going to say to this? You know what after I solved the problem, you know what she said about this text? What do you think she said to me afterwards when I solved the problem? I'm sorry. Exactly. So let's get off the high horse right now when you're dealing with somebody angry, and not the no daughter of mine is going to talk to me like this. You want to solve somebody's problem, you got to get off the moral high ground. Good. Okay. Calling somebody out for bad behavior will inevitably make it worse. So you have left your ego out of it. You've gotten off the high horse. Now what? Number 2, anger is a reactive emotion. So the key is to find its source. If anger is something that's provoked, you could start to focus like a laser on the anger, or you could do the smart, insightful thing of trying to understand the cause of the anger. Mediators will focus on the cause of the anger. So let's do some helpful theory. It'll take us 30 seconds of philosophy, and we'll be in, we'll be out, we'll be done. Philosophers think about anger as one of the moral emotions, which is ironic, right? Because it causes a lot of heinous in human life. The reason that philosophers call it a moral emotion is because it's a category of emotional response that flags when you are under siege. You get angry when you're under threat. That can be a moral threat, psychological threat. Somebody cuts you off on the interstate. It's a physical threat. Anger is an emotion that is there to get you protected before your brain can say, I am being insulted. Anger comes first. Then you use your mind to say, now why did that make me angry? Anger is a category of emotional response that functions as a radar, beep, 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 to detect when an individual has the perception of moral offense, wrongdoing, slight, or harm. It can be a misunderstanding. Everybody coming into that room might love Fred, but Fred doesn't think so. Perception in anger management, in conflict management, in mediation is everything. We can sort through misperceptions, but we have to take the perception as the truth as we're trying to solve it, right? We've got to work with people's perceptions, even if the gods would say there's a misunderstanding. There's 3 classic moral emotions: anger, resentment, and indignation. Resentment is where you feel you've been offended for a long time. It's a seething, long-standing feeling that you've been wronged. Indignation is how could you? How dare you? All of those are flags for something that we feel is violating our integrity, whether that's physical, emotional, psychological, spiritual. So anger is a reaction. And if it's a reaction to the perception of harm, you've got to find out why people feel harmed. And when you find out why they're feeling harmed, you can solve that problem and de-escalate the anger. That's the idea of it. So let's return to Fred. If you think about Fred's attitude as an expression of a moral emotion, then you'd ask, does he have any reasons for the perception that he's being slighted in this hospital? Well, your brainstorm of putting yourself in his shoes thought, maybe, yeah. How often does he feel patronized, dismissed, demeaned, humiliated, or stereotyped? How often does he have the perception of that? Because if the answer is at least some of the time, that's what you want to do to work with the combative and uncivil Fred. How many indignities has he been subjected to? How many, does he feel, yeah, he feels powerless by the injury, but does he also feel that there's things that are going on that in the treatment that make him feel powerless, like the 7 a.m., you're going to get up and you're going to get what you get and you don't get upset? Does he feel that the care team is prejudiced by his past truancy or heroin use? Does he feel the victim of being branded drug-seeking or gang member or high school dropout or junkie? If the answer to any of those questions is yes, you need to solve the problem that's provoking the anger. Let's do that first, and let's see if there's any incivility left, and then we can, think differently. When somebody is angry, look for the reasons they feel mistreated, misunderstood, or wronged, and address those grievances. That's what you do with an angry person. Now, the key step here, then, is to ennoble the anger. What I mean by that is this. Let me take this back. Whoops, I can do it. There you go. Let me talk just about this concept of ennoble. I don't mean that you say, boy, anger's great. What I mean is that you say, I am witnessing anger. Anger is a symptom of something. I need to find its source, and now I'm going to do that. Because think about in the parallel to the clinical arena. Vomit and diarrhea aren't pleasant either, but nobody goes, vomiter in the room, let's go, everybody out. People say they're vomiting because something's wrong with the GI system. This person has diarrhea. We got to solve the GI problem. They aren't like, oh, I'm sorry, this person's a diarrhea. Let's go. Anger is emotional diarrhea. You want you want it to stop, get to the source. And that's what I mean by ennoble it. You don't ridicule somebody because they're vomiting. You figure out what the problem and the cause is. That's what I mean by ennoble anger. Anger is seen by most people as being very uncouth, very, it's not civil, it's wrong, it's bad character. You know what it is? It's the radar system human beings have to stay safe. And yes, some of us do better at being able to keep it in check, and others say, what the are you doing to me? Right? Different people have different abilities to modulate in stressful situations. The thing is, though, when somebody is escalating with swear words, I love to swear, but I won't do too much tonight. Swear words, volume, tone, body posture. Our response, especially to those of you who are conflict averse, is to move back. But if I'm right, your unsympathetic and defensive response to my saying, I have a problem, I've been slighted, I've been harmed, and you move back like this, what do? I go back up, right? I say, how do you not hear me? Right? If anger is expressing to you something is wrong, somebody is wronging me, I'm under siege, and you go like this, then I have to say, obviously you don't give a about me, and so I have to say louder. You need to break that cycle. To break that cycle, I want you to reach past this anger, dignify and ennoble it by doing what? And this is how we get to the end of the talk. Get to the speaker's core claims. You're going to ennoble the anger by trying to figure out the why. Focus on the why is this person angry and what's the substantive content of this person's claim. What I'm going to call the speaker's truth. What is their perspective, their grievance, their concern? I'm not saying that's God's truth. I'm saying it's the speaker's truth. And if you want to try to de-escalate somebody who's angry, you need to get to their truth. You see this ugly blue? This is the words that begin with F, the brown words, the volume. That's form. I want you to laser lock on content. The diamond inside the ugliness. You know how sometimes people will say, let somebody vent, and then you can say, now why don't you tell me what's wrong? Every time I hear that, my skin crawls. The venting, folks, has content, right? How many times do you shout at somebody, are you going like this, blah, 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 blah. You have content. You need to laser lock on that content. What is the substantive content of what they're asserting? Yes, with swear words and ugliness, doesn't matter. What does that person think is factually true? What's the essence of the complaint? Strip the message off of the animosity and the slander and the foul words. Just ignore it and laser lock on what they're trying to tell you. Just let all that go and laser lock on their meaning and restate it back. Like, so it sounds like you're really worried about. So the way that you see it, from where you sit, it feels like. Is it correct to say that your view is what you're experiencing? Your anger is because. After you hear it, you state it back, because then what's happening with our hand puppets is I'm up here and I repeat, then I lower a little bit, then I repeat, and then this person lowers, and then I repeat, and then this person lowers, and now we're talking like adults. That's called match and lower, classic mediation technique. Okay, remember Katie? Probably wondering what's going on. I'll tell you what's going on. Her mother, who's a stupid mother, promised her that she'd put her cell phone back on after she taught at 6:30. She teaches an evening class. Forgot and went out for dinner. Poor Katie is rising 9th grader in Princeton High School, and the summer reading, wait for it, is Homer's Odyssey. I still can't believe it. 2 years later, they changed the book to The Secret Life of Bees. But my daughter had to read Homer's Odyssey. She's trying to read the Odyssey. She can't understand it. Have you ever tried to read it? You need a professor to do it. You can't read that thing on your own when you're 14 years old. She's afraid she's not going to be able to pass 9th grade. She's never going to graduate from high school. My God, she's never going to get into college. Then she's going to be unemployed. And that's what's going on. And she's trying to reach me, and I'm not answering. And so she's texting me. All right, you get the thing. Okay, so then I finally get her, and then I hear her, and I say, so it sounds like you're very angry with me because I forgot to turn on the phone, and of course you were frustrated because I told you I would respond, blah, 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 and then it sounds like you're really worried about the blah, 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 and it sounds like you've got a lot of fear about the blah, 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 and I do all that, and then what happens? She says, I'm sorry, I shouldn't have sent that text. Right. Okay, sum it all up. Difficult people should be viewed as a syndrome and not a species. As soon as you say, well, that Katie, you might as well reform school that Katie. She's going nowhere. Actually, she's graduating from Penn. She just got an award for justice. You lock somebody down into species, there's nothing that can be done. Angry people are experiencing a syndrome. They're not a species. Anger is a reactive emotion. Find the source and try to solve the problem. But even naming the problem when it's coming at you is going to go a long way into getting that conversation back down to civil. You can escalate or de-escalate a situation that's brewing within seconds. Think about how you accidentally cut somebody off when you're driving. You roll down the window and you say, I'm so sorry about that. The person says what to you? I'm so sorry, I didn't mean that. They say to you what? It's okay. It's okay. But what if you say, I don't know what you're getting so mad about. Woo, right? You can escalate or de-escalate in seconds. Be the people who de-escalate. Don't call people out for bad behavior when they're angry. It's a big mistake. You see all these signs all over. I won't treat you unless you're doing this, that, and the other thing. You will not talk to me like that. From a mediator perspective, it's absolutely the wrong way to go. Try not to call people out for their bad behavior. Try to hear them, try to solve it, then let's see if they themselves apologize for their bad behavior. Then you've really got win-win. Try to get to neutrality. It's very hard. Of course, when you're the stupid mother and F's are coming at you, try to get to neutrality so that you can get a little bit of perspective to try to solve the angry person's problem. Try to get to their interests. What does Katie want? Katie wants to be able to go to college. She wants to do well in high school. She doesn't want to feel stupid. She doesn't want to feel like everybody else can do the work and she can't. Get to people's interests And if at the end you can say, I'm so sorry this happened to you, even better. All right, I am done.
Thank you so much. That was lovely. Would you mind if I start us off with a question?
You please.
So can you share with us your thoughts how some health systems have transitioned to labeling patients with previous bad behavior in the medical record? On one hand, we know that people with bad behavior, the big risk factor for future bad behavior is a history of bad behavior. But on the other hand, the patient coming in should have a chance for a clean slate. They have a new encounter. It's a different experience for them.
I think the problem's even worse than that. I'll take your question, then I'm going to up the ante, and I raise you, because you're not only is it the case that somebody should have a fresh start, it's that what I'm worried about is that we didn't solve their problem in the first place. If they're angry about what happened on the unit and then they come back, they are very likely to still harbor that anger if nobody ever addressed the problem that made them angry in the first place. And I like that one of the audience members used the word trauma in a previous question to Dr. Rosoff, and I thought it was such a great place to go. Medicine is now worried about what's called trauma-infused care. And what I'm worried about, I love that, and I think it's so important. But we've gotten to the point now where we've got categories of people that we assume would be traumatized. And sexual assault victims, absolutely. And marginalized groups, absolutely. But what I want to say is you can't see somebody's trauma written on their shirt. You can't just imagine that when you're encountering someone, this is the person who's had trauma and this is the person who hasn't. So my worry about these flaggings in the medical record is that you don't actually know whether that person experienced some kind of trauma in healthcare delivery or in their life just by their demographic. And so that's another layer to me that's worrisome about these flags.
So it sounds like you're advocating for context, understanding a bit more about the why, what happened.
I am, because to me, you can't solve a problem unless you understand the why. I mean, for example, Penn had this I'm from the University of Pennsylvania, and as Dr. Rosoff said, there's sometimes where there's a big gun that owns basically healthcare in a city. Well, you can imagine Penn owns a lot of the healthcare in the city of Philadelphia, though there's some other great health systems there too. But they had a billboard, and it said, ready for it? Your life deserves Penn medicine. Well, by God, you better live up to that, folks, because when you're in the ICU and they've been guns blazing and now they're saying, you know what, it's time for comfort care, and you feel betrayed because your life deserves Penn medicine, but your dad should go to comfort care, and you're mad because wait, this isn't what I thought I was getting. Okay. Instead of flagging that family in the record, we need to address the fact that this family feels betrayed by your life deserves Penn medicine. Flagging them for the future just meant that you didn't deal with the problem when you had the problem in front of you.
So that what if and this is from one of the audience members, what if that context, what if the why behind the interest or the behavior is unethical? What do we do with the healthcare worker?
Say it again. Say, you mean, who's the unethical person?
If the why behind this behavior
was that the healthcare provider didn't do something right, or that the patient...
It feels like the question is, if the bad behavior was fueled by an unethical reason why.
So in other words, can the audience member just give it to me a little bit more clearly? I just need to who did the unethics? Who was the one who's unethical? Nobody wants to?
Oh,
you're going to
Alyssa?
help me. Give me an example of what would that be? There's no difference between talking, you don't have to talk in the mic, I can hear you, and I'll repeat your question. You don't have to talk in the mic. But give me an example of what the kind of unethical would be. Race, so for example, I'm mad. Okay, so the reason that I'm so angry is because I've been treated, the last time I was here, I was treated by individuals that I didn't think were qualified to treat me because of their race. Is that the kind of a why? I'm mad because they force people on me that I don't think are qualified to treat me. And my prejudice is that's because they're a woman or they're from a certain ethnicity. So today, this group is going to say to that person, your reasons for being angry are ethically unsupportable. That's the kind of question that you're thinking. Okay, great. I think it depends on what you're after. A mediator is after win-win. Every single time that person encounters this health system, and every single time that person is treated by someone that makes them upset, and we just say, I'm sorry, you get what you get and you don't get upset, we have lost an opportunity to actually address that person's concern. So what a mediator would try to do is talk to that person about, why don't you want a woman to take care of you? What is it that makes you concerned about women taking care of you? And let's say that person feels that that person believes that women are not as smart as men. Then a mediator might say, it sounds like you have a deep concern about whether you're going to get competent care. But I'm wondering if you would allow us to try to demonstrate to you that the women on our staff are as competent as the men on the staff. I'm wondering if you would give us the opportunity to try to show you that we really do have outstanding personnel of every stripe. Could you, instead of saying, we don't tolerate, that kind of thing, what if we said, can you give us an opportunity to try to show you that the care is the same? Or can I talk to you about how we train? Can I do something to try to help you with your concern and still not betray the values of the institution, is that namely that every person here is equally qualified to care for you. But the alternative is that we basically would need that person to go somewhere else. Like, my worry is that if I'm not a physician, I'm a philosopher, but I try to think about what it would mean for me to try to care for this person who thinks I'm not good enough to care for them. As a mediator, what I would try to do is say, can you give me an opportunity to try? And I do believe in the power of change. My father-in-law is 93. When I met him in the 80s, he did not have one woman physician. And if you had asked him in the late 80s if he wanted to have a woman physician, he would have been like, I'm not going to have one. I don't think that women should be doctors. And 93, fast forward 50 years. I only see women. Women are the best doctors. They're a lot more empathic. A woman saved my life. I went to her. She saw stage 1 esophageal cancer. It was 30 years ago. I swear by them. I'm only going to be treated by women. Now, why do I use that as an example? Because if I had forced it on him, if we had forced it on him in the 80s, I'm not sure we'd be here in 2023. What happened was he got his own proof. And they're suffering in the meantime, and I don't deny it. But the change that has happened in him by working with him, that to me is, a great benefit and the ideal. Because now he's on the circuit to advocate for women doctors. So when I hear that, the reason is unethical, a mediator still wants to hear it and see what can we do, even though that's controversial. But that's what mediators think. It's a great question.
So it's interesting. You described this behavior of, we don't want you to do this, we don't want you to do that. The question from the audience is, how do you feel about hospitals having zero tolerance policies?
So here's the thing. Mediators think about win-win, lose-win, win-lose, right? Those are our options. What does a mediator want? Win-win. A zero tolerance policy is a win-lose. So a mediator doesn't like a win-lose, even though on principle grounds, I totally understand the zero tolerance, because it does mean that the hospital is standing up for righteousness and for equality and inclusion and everything that matters to me too. But it will produce a win-lose. So what I want to do as a mediator is see if I can turn the lose into a win by not doing that.
Fair enough. I think some people will argue that there's a reality of being in the room with people that are acting inappropriately.
Yes.
And the reality, the question comes from the idea of how do you restate their concerns without coming across as patronizing? That tends to escalate.
Oh, yes, right. I mean, you remember that childhood game? You remember that childhood game where everything you said, somebody repeated, and it's maddening, right? So, but the thing is, paraphrasing and restatement is absolutely critical to make good on your claim that you say all the time. You've got these stock phrases you say in your life. No, I hear you. Oh, no, I totally understand. No, I totally get that. All that's BS. The only way you can make good on a claim like that, Paul Barkowski, that's the real name of my husband. Paul Barkowski, the only way you can make good on the claim, no, I hear you, is to repeat what I've said. Because that's how we prove that you've actually heard the content of what I've said. But what my husband does is this very thing. He's very smart. He's got a PhD in chemical engineering and practically a recorder in his brain. So if I've just said, I really think we ought to think about our travel plans for Spain. And then I'll say, Paul, are you listening? Absolutely. Absolutely. I know he's not listening. Then I'll say, what'd I say? He'll say, I think that we ought to think about our future travel plans for Spain. It's a recorder. You were not listening. It's just right. So the restatement has to be a paraphrase. In other words, he could show me he was actually listening by saying, you're talking about Spain. You're concerned that we're getting close to the trip and we haven't made any plans. Right. Now I know you've heard me. You can't parrot because parroting is condescending and it's also got that, oh, you're just spitting back thing. You need to paraphrase what people are saying. Because after all, if somebody's angry, you want to parrot back the F's and the loud and whatever. No, you want to paraphrase the content in your own words. And that's how you demonstrate, I hear you. You don't say, oh, Autumn, I heard you. Show me you heard me. When you were in high school, did you have this show me, not tell me? Show, not tell. This is a big trope in high school English essays. What does it mean? It means prove it. You understand my claim about your life deserves Penn medicine and now we have all these intensivists and every 2 weeks we're in whiplash because, they changed the goals of care. You want to say that you heard the patient? Repeat it back. You've seen a lot of buzz about Penn that claims that we're all that. And right now, you're not feeling like you're getting all that. In fact, it sounds to me like what you're saying is you're hearing different things from different people. You see how that is not parroting? That's taking the content and really getting down deep into what it is and saying it back.
And that can be really helpful for certain situations, right? This question comes from when one problem solves with someone who's truly just letting off steam, this approach can be more infuriating to them. How do you tell the difference?
I had a student in a mediation intensive, I do these workshops, and I had a student who said, whenever I'm angry, I actually have a reason. When other people are angry, they never have a reason. So I ask you, raise your hand if you get angry with no reason. I'm just standing here, I'm having my talk, I'm doing my thing. Why are you not listening? What? Who acts like that? Nobody does that. Everybody has a reason. So what you want to do is figure out what the reason is. Now, let's say they are angry at something else. That's still a reason. In other words, I'm going to get your question. Who are the people that are just letting off steam? Do you do that? Do you just go blah, 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 blah? What does that mean to just let off steam? What people are doing when they let off steam is expressing content in a way that has a lot of volume to it. Or maybe their fuse is a little bit short. If I have just been cut off on my way home by somebody and I've had a really hard talk and the students were, they didn't do their homework or whatever, I'm already amped up, yeah. But when I get home and the Indian takeout food is glued to the granite counter, is it really the case that I don't have a reason to say, does anybody in this house know how to work a sponge? Do I really not have a reason? I have a reason. If you have Indian takeout, you owe me that you clean up your own Indian takeout. I have a reason, even if, had I had a good day, I'd say, folks, anybody got a sponge? And because somebody cut me off, I'm like, can anybody use a sponge? That doesn't mean I didn't have a reason. So what I challenge for the person in the audience who said that is, when is somebody just blowing off steam? What does that mean? People have reasons.
Actually, that was my question. The reason I wrote it is because of my 2 offspring, one of them, when they are texting and arguing and they're upset about something, and I would go into, problem-solving mode and trying to ask and, and so forth. And finally, that particular offspring just said, "Mom, I'm just ranting, okay? I'm just ranting, and it doesn't have anything to do with you. I'm just ranting." She's letting off steam. And so what our arrangement became is that when that particular person is ranting, and this is generally in text because we can't see each other face to face, they preface it with ranting, and then they rant. And then they feel better, and I understand that I am not trying to solve a problem for them that isn't my problem to solve and that they don't really want me to solve.
Okay,
That's my question is, I can see that people are doing that, somebody doing that because they're hyped up, frustrated, and that it's not a problem that you can necessarily solve or that they even want you to solve.
Okay.
They just want to get it out.
But those are 2 different things. Sometimes people want to be heard, but they don't want you to try to solve the problem. They want to be heard, and then they're going to manage their own problem. But that doesn't mean that they're ranting. What it means is the utterances they're making are basically, I've got something that I'm working on. I'm really upset about it. I just want somebody to hear that I'm trying to work this out. And here's what just happened. So, for example, let's say it's in high school and somebody made a snide remark, and then the teacher laughed at them or whatever. And what they don't want is for you to go in there and talk to Mr. Who's it about that class. That's what they don't want. What they do want is for you to say, "Oh my gosh, that is so awful that somebody would laugh at you like that." They don't want you to solve the problem. They want you to hear. That doesn't make it ranting. In other words, all I'm going to do is just correct the word rant or vent because it implies just let people go blah, 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 blah. And I believe angry people don't want that. They want, even if they don't want you to take the next step, which is solve, they want that interim step. I'm probably out of time. They want that interim step that you're hearing them and that you're saying that you're proving to them that you're hearing them. That's what I mean. So when people are letting off steam, I think what they're actually doing is saying, I have a problem. I don't want you to solve it, but I want you to hear it. And I want you to connect with me in an empathic way and hear my suffering. And that also is an active connection with somebody and a de-escalation. Am I out of time?
Thank you so much.
You're welcome. You're welcome.
Round of applause. If everyone's okay, I'm going to call an audible. Can we have Dr. Rosoff come back and join us, please? We would like to try asking some of these questions and hearing the difference in response from our 2 presenters here. Safety of healthcare providers should be paramount. It becomes an ethical challenge when situations become violent. So the duty of the nurse is to continue to care for that patient, even the violent patient, until it becomes unreasonable level of risk. Healthcare workers should be allowed to perform these duties and do so in a safe environment. Do you have any suggestions on how to align healthcare safety along these same lines that work with law enforcement and public offices?
I think you should go first because it's definitely your...
So I think that institutions, employers have a contractual duty to their employees, to their staff, for a modicum of safety. And that is ironclad. So let's think back 3 years. Around this time 3 years ago, our healthcare institutions in the United States failed at that contractual obligation or duty miserably because of their cost-cutting and their cost-saving measures to provide personal protective equipment throughout the beginning part of the pandemic to their staff. So they were unable to keep their staff safe in an environment in which they should have expected to be safe, leading to the deaths and the disability of hundreds, if not thousands, of healthcare workers across the United States. Similarly, I think that healthcare institutions also have a contractual, if not moral duty, to ensure that their workplace environment is as safe as it can be in a profession that is inherently risky. So as an example, they have a duty to provide devices to minimize the risk of self-injury from sharp needles, scalpel blades, etc. There are many different aspects of staff safety, and I should add, patient safety. So it's not only staff who are at risk from violent patients and violent family members, but other patients and other staff members, and other visitors, family members, as well as staff who are at risk from violent or potentially violent patients and staff members. And to the extent that it is possible to minimize those risks, there is a contractual and moral duty for institutions to do that. Now the question is how they go about doing that. And that's the hard question. So, Autumn's patient, what was his name?
Fred.
Fred. I remember consulting on a patient very, very similar to this, who was 22 years old, a well-known member of a local gang, who was shot a little bit higher up in his neck, and it was a complete comminuted C3, C4 fracture. So he was truly paralyzed from the neck down and ventilator dependent. And so that means, for those of you who aren't familiar with these kinds of patients, he was ventilator dependent. He could not speak. And so he had a tracheostomy. And so all he could do was wordlessly mouth obscenities at his caregivers with no sound coming out, but easy to read his lips. And this, it was 2 months into his hospital stay, what was driving his caregivers crazy. He was obviously angry. All of the things that Fred was able to do, but without any sound. And without any rehab, because he was unrehabable, for the most part. I think that, but I think there are also crazy responses to this. And I'm sorry for going on and on and on about this. We had another case where a patient's boyfriend, we, by the way, at the place where I used to work, got rid of metal flatware for patient food long time ago. Okay, so now it's just plastic stuff, and it's probably the compostable stuff too, right? It's very good for the environment. A patient's boyfriend was angry for some reason, and so he picked up the plastic knife off of the dinner tray. Now, I don't know if you've ever seen these plastic knives, but the blade is about 1 inch long with a little serrated edge. You couldn't hurt yourself if you tried to do anything with it. But this escalated so quickly. The nursing staff, he was yelling and screaming and waving this little plastic knife around. They called the Duke police. Now, Now the Duke, what did I just say? Or did I say something? So
No.
the Duke police come in two flavors. There are the security guys who are overweight and old, and they don't carry anything more than handcuffs and walkie-talkies. And then there are the Duke police, and they are deputized officers of the law, and they carry guns. And that's who came. And so this is a unit with 24 patients. It was right during visiting hours. So there were family members all over the place, including, this was an adult unit, so there were even kids visiting their parents or relatives. And the Duke police came with guns drawn at this guy with a little plastic knife. And thank God somebody came and de-escalated the situation and told them to go away because they were going to shoot him. Yeah. And I bet they would have. Right. So I'm going to use that to segue to you.
No, I think that's exactly, when people are truly under threat, that's not a time for mediation. I mean, if instead of a plastic knife, he actually had a gun, then the Duke police would be an appropriate response to a gun. And I think that because terrible, terrible things have happened and people have been victims of violence, they are naturally concerned that something like that will happen. And so, but what we do have to, we just have to keep our wits about us about, has this gone to that point or are we on this side of the line? And if we're on this side of the line, then we need a mediator to try to talk that person down and have them put the plastic knife down without having the Duke police. And I think that's where healthcare systems are getting confused. This stuff is real, and so they have not found a way to draw the line. All this stuff over here is not physical threat. I mean, I love your story about this terrible tragedy where this man, not only can he not hit anyone, he actually can't verbalize anything. He's just mouthing it. But we can't call that violence. We have to leave violence to violence. Violence is violence. The line that if you haven't crossed that line, then we have to talk and we have to try to de-escalate. And I do think that part of the solution is to get people, like it sounds like at Duke somebody came in who had real skills. We got to get people trained up to do that kind of de-escalation when it's sort of making the nurses and the physicians feel like it's getting close to that line. Over here, we can just have what I call fire extinguisher skills like I gave you tonight. Close to that line, you need firefighter skills. You need people with real expertise in how to de-escalate so that this does not get confused with this. This is a big thing, a theme in Philadelphia, because a lot of people with mental illness are getting shot by police. You know, they're angry, but they're actually not violent, and they're getting shot. So we really need experts in that zone where the staff are feeling concerned that it is turning violent. They don't have the skills. It hasn't gotten to that point where it's clearly a police matter.
So I think that some hospitals, not all, are investing in what are called behavioral response teams, who are trained to de-escalate, particularly de-escalate these situations, particularly with potentially mentally ill individuals who are particularly in city hospitals, are in our hospitals all over the place. They're in the emergency room. And they are trained to de-escalate, to physically take down individuals without harming them, to not shoot them, to not tase them, to not physically harm them, and recognizing situations for what they are. That being said, these are complicated situations. The easy cases are easy. That's why they're easy. It's the hard cases that are difficult to distinguish, particularly in the moment, where things can get out of control and escalate very, very quickly. And hospitals tend to see things very often in black and white. Fix this now. Time is money, and particularly with more personnel, that's more money that we're not going to get compensated for, even if in the end run it saves us money and saves us time. But in the moment, it doesn't.
And I'll just say one last thing on that point. The more people have these basic conflict management skills, the less likely they are to have situations get into that gray zone, and the more confident they are going to be that they actually are in a situation that they can de-escalate.
Thank you so much. Can we give a round of applause to our speakers? I would like now to turn this over back to Lola Koch, the wonderful, wonderful Lola.
Thank you so much, Dr. Francis, Dr. Rossoff, and Dr. Feaster, for your excellent presentations, moderations. Thank you, audience, for your thoughtful and thought-provoking questions. Based on the stack of questions, I would have to say that we could stay here for at least another hour or more to answer the questions that I saw in the questions that I picked up. So clearly, this is a topic that's a hot topic that's near and dear to all of our hearts that work interprofessionally in healthcare. But thank you so much. Another round of applause for our speakers. Again, I want to acknowledge our sponsors, Corewell Health, who is a principal sponsor, and our major sponsor, Trinity Health, for their support of this event this evening. To end this event, I just want to remind everybody in the audience, if you have CME that you need to attend to make sure you get that handout, because you do have to register in the cloud, and it's a little bit of a process if you're a physician. And for those to obtain nursing CEs, which is provided by us at Kirchhoff College of Nursing. Social work continuing ed credits are also provided by Spectrum, by Corewell Spectrum. And the reason I say Spectrum Corewell is because they haven't turned their website over yet, so you'll still see Spectrum. So that's why they asked that I do say Spectrum Corewell with that. So you'll receive an email, as I mentioned before, for your CEs if you're social work or nursing, based on your attendance, your registration and attendance. And again, for CE providers, be sure you pick that up. One correction I want to make on the agenda, and also in the email that I sent to those of you that are physicians, it's actually 53266. So hopefully everyone is still on and listening. I had put on the agenda 523. Those numbers are transposed. So it's 53266 if you're a physician provider. Make sure you text your email address to that phone number, and make sure you use that event ID so that you can get your CMEs if you're a physician provider. We also ask you to complete an evaluation. It's so vitally important to us on the advisory board of the Colloquy that we hear your feedback. Good, honest feedback, candid feedback is greatly appreciated, and also accolades as well. So if you have questions about CE or CME, you can text Health Campus Events. And if you have any other questions, you can use that same email. But also, this concludes our event for this evening. And I want to wish all of you safe travels home. Get some good rest. Our students that are here, our providers that are here, it's late. So get some good rest, drive careful, and thank you so much for attending this evening. Have a great evening.